So I welcome everyone to this breakout session. Happy World Access to Higher Education Day. This is the session entitled Pathways and Opportunities for Non-Traditional Students in COVID-19 and Beyond. And we will try to maximize the time that we have. We have about an hour. And if we could just show on screen show format our deck, that would be appreciated. Ricky, can you just do it on slideshow format? Okay, so we'll be making some adjustments given this, but on the next slide, we'd love for you to understand that your insights matter. And so there will be 3 Slido polls that we will use for this session. That you use the chat feature to articulate questions that we will do our best to answer at the end of our conversation. Now, folks, you will be using the Slido account. If you can use your QR reader, you could find there the QR code. You could log on to www.slido.com and use the event code #73326 so that you could join our polls. Okay, so Rika, Freya, and the rest of the team will help me out with the technicals here given our current constraint. But I'd like now to move forward towards the introduction of our conversation panelists. I think they're all here now. So I'd like to introduce the members of our conversation panel. Our first speaker is Mr. Musa Fazal, the Group Director of the Planning Group of Skills Future Singapore. Good afternoon, Mr. Musa. Okay, and our director is the principal of Lady Shri Ram College for Women, University of Delhi in India, Dr. Suman Sharma. Good afternoon, Dr. Sharma.
Good afternoon.
Finally, we have the Deputy Director of SDG Academy Indonesia, Tanoto Foundation Indonesia, Mr. Yosia Cornianto. Good afternoon, Yosia.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ed.
There you go. So I think we are all complete and we can begin our conversation. So I'd like us to begin by looking at who are our non-traditional students for whom we are thinking of provisions given the pandemic. So what I'm going to do is to activate our first poll over at slido.com. If you could just participate in this short poll, we would love for you to use a word or a phrase to identify or describe the non-traditional students. So it could be a phrase or a word that you may use to identify our non-traditional students. So take note that you could enter more than one answer. So let's give ourselves a minute or two to look at the answers of our participants. Again, over at slido.com, the event code is #73326. So let's wait for about a minute or two to show the responses of our participants. Meantime, our distinguished panelists are going to prepare for them to answer the questions that we have prepared. Okay, so Rika, I'll try to share with you the results over here because I cannot access it directly onto my phone, but let me see what I can do. As we are waiting for the first set of responses. So we are waiting for the responses of most of our participants. So let's just wait for that. Okay, Rika, I'm having a little problem here, but I will just make mention of the major answers that have been given to us over at Slido. So to our speakers, the key words that have been shared so far are the words international, special needs, adult, unconventional and driven, remaining relevant, diverse, and older students. So I will read out the ones which will bear the biggest number of responses and share with the team in a little while. All right, so here are the responses that we got from some of our participants. So the words are access to mainstream, older students, international, special needs, unconventional and driven, and slightly older students. Then mobile, challenge, adult. So thank you so much for those who placed in their responses. Now I think we could ask our panelists to give some of their point of view for about 3 minutes each on 3 discussion points. And these are prior to COVID-19, what key challenges in terms of access and success have non-traditional students been struggling with? How did COVID-19 make the situation of non-traditional students even more challenging? And based on your experience in terms of engaging in the education of non-traditional students, what was your major adjustment? I think we could begin listening to Mr. Musa Fazal for his perspective. Mr.
Okay,
Musa,
thanks.
go ahead.
Thanks very much, Ed. So very happy to be here and to be able to share perspectives and to learn from everyone at this conference. Just a little bit of background about myself. So I'm not an educator, so I can't really answer question 3 hand on my heart. I come from the public sector. I'm part of the government. I'm in a statutory board under the Ministry of Education in Singapore. And we're charged with the objective of trying to ensure that the workforce in Singapore is equipped with the skills necessary for the future economy and to promote a culture of lifelong learning. So I think given my background, in terms of the segments of non-traditional students that I'd be more familiar with, it would be the adult learners and mature learners. So I'll focus on those 2 groups. And I thought I could answer these questions by basically focusing on what I think are the 2 key barriers when it comes to access for these groups. So one of the key barriers is lack of time, and the second one is lack of formal qualifications. So in terms of lack of time, I think all of you will know that if you're a mature learner, if you're already in the workplace, then you have work, you have family responsibilities. And so time is a major barrier to being able to participate in educational and training opportunities. And even if you're able to overcome barriers in terms of lack of access to financial resources, what we find is that time it becomes a significant hurdle that is very difficult to overcome. And I think the way that higher education institutions have responded to this in the past has been really to try to accommodate such adult learners by providing the same content in terms of existing programs that they already have, but to do it in a part-time format, so to have evening classes or weekend classes and so on. But I think increasingly, to be able to cater to the needs of this segment of non-traditional students, there's a need for modularization of programs, making available bite-sized programs that can be stackable to a full qualification. So allowing the individual the flexibility to basically work his way towards a qualification over time, as and when his schedule permits. And I think that sort of flexibility is something that a lot of adult learners desire. The other key barrier that I wanted to talk about was the lack of formal qualifications. So I think many adult learners may not have acquired the necessary formal qualifications during their days when they were going through school to allow them to now pursue higher education. And this then becomes a barrier to their career progression and prospects in terms of career mobility. And I think COVID-19 has exacerbated this situation because, in Singapore, for example, there are some sectors which are very severely affected, tourism, aviation. And the lack of formal qualifications then becomes a barrier to allow individuals who are displaced from their jobs in these sectors to pivot to alternative jobs and take advantage of those job opportunities in sectors which are still hiring. So I think increasingly institutions have had to reassess their approach to this, their approach to setting sort of minimum entry requirements for their programs, to recognize prior learning, recognize work experience. And I think that's an important change, and COVID-19 has sort of accelerated that process. Yeah, so those were the two things I wanted to share. Thanks, Ed.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Musa. I think from the government perspective, we can now move towards the academic perspective from Dr. Sharma. Dr. Sharma, your perspective, please.
To address this August gathering, and also I feel this time's theme, access to higher education, is very relevant. I have been a part of ASEF since last 4-5 years, and I feel that it's a real learning process when we share the best practices as well as the lessons from the field practices. Today in the morning, I realized when they were talking of CMEO about how the Southeast Asian countries have got together and are doing quite a lot about Southeast Asia. I was wondering, could it be with South Asia also, or some sort of an Asian cooperation on higher education? I felt it was really a good idea. Now, regarding your first question as to whom do we think come under this category, I feel in terms of India, it is very difficult to say because we have diversity, rich diversity in terms of culture. We have around 200 languages, out of which 20 are official, more than 20 are official languages. Diversity in terms of caste, class, region, and religion. We have a very large population, but we enjoy the demographic dividend. This demographic dividend we cannot enjoy till we take care of all our youngsters, especially the non-traditional students. Now, I was trying to identify in terms of India in particular, also South Asia, who are the ones who can be categorized in this category. It is those who belong to social, economically disadvantaged background, those who do not have a high school diploma, they are working full-time or part-time on a small salary, they have a large family, they go for part-time courses, and they are around the age of 25. Now, during COVID, I would like to say it's not only the formal or it's not only the non-traditional or informal students who are suffering. Being from a premier educational institution, I can share it with you that even in the formal education system, our students are really suffering because of the digital divide. Another problem which I would like to highlight in context of India is the large migration from bigger cities to smaller cities or to the villages. Now, how are we tackling this? We have had a number of programs which have been initiated by the government. Would you like me to name some of them?
Okay, Dr. Sharma, perhaps some of them that would be appreciated.
Just 2-3. That is called as Garib Kalyan Rozgar Abhiyan, which is the opportunities for the migrant villagers who have returned back to their villages. Because there is a large scale migration in India. Then we also have separate ones for northeastern states. Then there is also a blended teaching sort of a thing, blending between teachers and the technology, and online teaching programs, not only for the schools, but also for the colleges. There are portals which have been developed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Now we move on to Yosia for his inputs.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Ed. I'm very happy to be among all the excellent speakers and also participants during this event. I'll try to speak briefly based on the questions before. So prior to COVID-19, the key challenges of the non-traditional students, in my perspective, and based on the working area or environment that I have, is I sum it as the enabling environment, I suppose. It's the non-traditional students within the traditional system where there is a mismatch between the needs or the characteristic of non-traditional students to be pushed to follow the traditional education system. So these two difference between characteristic of learners and also the learning environment can actually be issue for them, because the non-traditional students obviously have probably different kind of changing priorities in terms of life stages and stuff. So therefore, traditional education system might not be able to provide what they really need. And the enabling environment also talks about policy, culture, the acceptability of the education itself or learning process itself in terms of employment or employability after the education or learning process happened. And obviously, non-traditional students, we also face an issue on financing on their educations or the learning because of other priorities that might remain in their journey of life. So the COVID-19 actually gives such pressures, quite unique pressure for the non-traditional students, especially for those who have multiple roles in society or business or organizations or governments, as their mind or their priority will change possibly to take care of the COVID-19 itself in terms of their working environment or their the first priority, and then their learning process. Aside of that, COVID-19 also now make people really awaken in terms of infrastructure, the infrastructure, the internet, and also the digital learning behavior for both non-traditional students and also the learning facilitator itself, as they're probably adult and not really technology savvy. Their adjusting process might take longer than the traditional students. So what I did in my working environment in terms of adjustment for these conditions, I might divide into existing programs and the new programs that we're trying to develop. The existing programs we actually focus on the giving opportunities or time or a process for the non-traditional students to adjust the phase or also allow them to adapt and learn new situations. Therefore, we might lower our expectations in the learning journey process, but not necessarily lowering the quality of our interactions with them. Therefore, we also try to offer assistance if they need kind of special assistance on technology adaptations or other stuff. They might provide them more convenience to learn. And also for existing program, we also try to contextualize the learning materials that we have into the current conditions so that it's more strongly connected with their situations. For the new programs, we try to redesign the methods of delivery. Previously, we also consider offline methods delivery, but we try to be more online with, of course, certain process of scaffolding, if you may say, to help the non-traditional students to learn at ease in the new environment. But also importantly, we try to relay our design on personalized learning, where the students or non-traditional students have a freedom to create learning more meaningful for them, more personalized for them. So we'll not, we will probably provide more kind of open-ended discussions or discourse, so then it can be more contextual. Therefore, the sense of ownership will be higher. We also obviously opportunities to apply collaborative in new ways with the group, virtual group discussions and stuff to ensure that they don't feel lonely in doing the learning process. Thank you.
Excellent points. And I think most of our speakers were able to already articulate some items related to the design and delivery of learning opportunities for non-traditional students. See, in the literature of non-traditional students' education, we can focus on reskilling, cross-skilling, and upskilling. Let's just ask briefly, in the interest of time, our distinguished panelists, which of these three would you think will provide more or should be the focus of provisions for non-traditional students in the COVID-19 pandemic? Is it more of reskilling, cross-skilling, or upskilling? Mindful of the fact that eventually our students will need to be employable. Let's begin probably with Dr. Sharma, followed by Mr. Musa, and then Mr. Yosia. Dr. Sharma, your quick perspective, please.
Yes. You know, I feel from Indian perspective also that we have to have a blending of all, reskilling as well as upskilling. You know, in India, there are a lot of training institutions which deal with the skilling, and also a number of them have come up during COVID times. But also there is the informal system whereby the students, they learn it from the families, or there is something called as traditional Asian, South Asian, or even Indian knowledge. So skilling can be divided into different parts, and efforts are being made in all these directions. Meanwhile, in June, in this August 2020, the government of India came up for the national education policy, which talks of all these three parts together. And this policy has come up after 34 years, which makes skilling a part of the national education. It is not only available in informal schools, open distance learning. It's also in the schools, and special efforts are being made to adjust maximum number of students in this, to make education more equitable and accessible to the youngsters.
Okay.
And this, it's this new education policy, why I'm emphasizing on this is more than, for 4 years, they have been taking the feedback, and the feedback was taken at the lowest level in the villages, in the block level, in the states also. More than 2.5 lakh feedback had come in the last 4 years. It was not only from academicians, from the members of parliament. This feedback had come from the grassroots levels. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Sharma, thank you. Because we were told that the Zoom session is going to close in about less than 10 minutes, I'll ask our two speakers to please keep their responses brief. Thank you so much. Mr. Musa, go ahead, please.
Hi, Ed. So I think my perspective is probably, I tend to agree with Dr. Sharma that all three are important, but I would say probably reskilling and cross-skilling at this point in time. Partly because I think there are some jobs that are just going to be lost and people will need to pivot into new types of jobs. So there'll be a need for people to relearn new skills. And for some jobs which are not going to be lost, I think what the COVID-19 disruption has done is it's accelerated the change in how those job roles are being performed in terms of the tasks that are involved in specific job roles. And that will require people to cross-skill, to learn new skills outside of their existing responsibilities. Thanks.
I think that's an important point because we are anticipating major shifts in various industry and employment sectors also. Yosia, from the youth's perspective, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to see the perspective from the education provider in terms of a learning provider. For example, the university might emphasize on the upskilling issues, embedding the new skills, future skills into their curriculum, ensure the students understand what might need to be added after their graduations.
Okay. Yosia, I think you're breaking up. Okay, while we're waiting for Yosia to proceed, I will ask our two speakers to start formulating the response on our final question, which has something to do with your practical advice for people who are providing services to non-traditional students. What might they be, or what would be good for them to focus on given our current restriction? So this time I'm going to go back to Dr. Sharma to give her inputs to this. Dr. Sharma, any practical advice to service providers of non-traditional students?
Number one is we will ask them to be patient. 2, expectations should not be very high. 3rd, what we are doing is maximum digitization and work from home. In India, there has been a lockdown for formal students also from March onwards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then quickly, Professor Musa, and I think we have lost Yosia at this point. Go ahead, Professor Musa.
Thanks, Ed. So I think quite a lot has been talked about in terms of how COVID has accelerated the transition to online learning, including forms of blended learning. So I won't belabor the points. I think that's an important transition in terms of how we deliver, how higher education institutions deliver their programs. And I think there are a lot of challenges in that transition. So it's not just a matter of converting content into an online learning format. There's a lot of skill involved in trying to deliver that content in a way that maintains the interactivity, keeps the classroom dynamic, and so on. So I think a lot of service providers in delivering such programs will need to think carefully about how they're going to go about addressing some of those challenges. There are also challenges associated with the digital divide, which I think has been brought up by Dr. Shanita during the keynote speeches, Dr. Sharma as well. And I think for the digital divide, there are two types of divides. There's an income divide and there's an age divide.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of mature learners, actually, it's quite challenging to fully embrace online learning, and they might need some additional help to be able to make use of the tools that are necessary to fully take advantage of the digital classroom. So I think that's something that, again, higher education institutions will need to think about. And I guess the last point that I wanted to raise, which I thought, I think higher education institutions might need to bear in mind when working with adult learners, is that adult learners are a lot more task-oriented. And Yosia referred to this, right? So he referred to this idea about non-traditional students having different needs, different attitudes to learning, and how does the higher education system adapt to that? I think for a lot of adult learners, they want to see the practical benefits of their education and training. So faculty need to be in touch with industry developments and reality on the ground. The content needs to be a lot more practical and applied. It can't be too theoretical. And one of the feedback that we often hear is that sometimes faculty in higher education institutions find it challenging to teach adult learners because their students know more about what's happening in the industry than they do. But the best faculty, I think, try to use this to their advantage. They encourage the sharing of experiences. They encourage learning amongst peers. And I think the best institutions have also developed strong partnerships with the industry, so they can offer students opportunities to develop practical and applied skills, project work with specific companies, structured on-the-job training opportunities as part of their overall holistic education. Thanks.
I'm glad that Mr. Musa has given us a kind of spectrum of options that higher education institutions can choose from, given our situation. And I think this actually communicates the fact that the education of non-traditional students is moving away from the concept merely of lifelong learning to life-wide learning, where there's a variety of options, digital or otherwise, personal or non-formal, informal, family-based, and even industry-based. We'd like to thank once again our resource persons despite the shortness of this session. Thank you so much for your wonderful inputs.